Blog Talk Radio.
Hi everyone, this is Camille from sunny California, and you're listening to the Coffee Chat with Camille show, which is a podcast series that interviews various guests about real-life topics for people who love to learn. Hi everyone, this is Camille, your host. Today our topic is transforming personal trauma into complex and likable characters. Our wonderful guest is Guy Morris. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about him before he comes on into the studio. He's retired from a 36-year leadership career with Fortune 100 software, high-tech, and global energy. Guy Morris has also been a published songwriter for Disney Records, screenplay writer for Sojourn Entertainment, a patented inventor, a Coast Guard charter captain, a PADI diver and adventurer, and now an author and publisher of intelligent, well-researched thrillers. Okay. You can buy books, it looks like, at his website, which is GuyMorrisBooks.com, and it's inside of the description. And also, this episode will be in our on our website, okay? And then you'll just look for the heading, Transforming Personal Trauma into Complex and Likable Characters with Guy Morris. All right, so we're going to let him on into the studio and get started with our interview. I'm so excited. Hi, Guy.
Hi, Camille. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm honored and a pleasure to be here.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you so much. It's my pleasure. We're going to go ahead and get started with our interview. So can you tell us about yourself and what makes you unique?
Well, I think a number of things. I'm not your typical executive. I'm not your typical author. I did start off. I have had a lot of diverse experiences in life, starting from the tragic and the difficult through the successful and the fun. I started life in an abusive home, alcoholic home, drug violent home. I actually was a 13-year-old runaway on the streets of Los Angeles for about several months. Before I went home long enough to earn a GED, and I was able to get a GED because out of the 10th grade, I quit after the 10th grade, because I had been working to support myself. I had been working alongside migrant workers for a number of years and frequently lied about my age in order to get a job. And those work credits allowed me to basically graduate high school. The downside is that I had a GED, which allowed me to get some jobs, but I was semi-functionally illiterate for the most part, because I had been, in the 10 years I'd gone to school, I'd been to 16 different schools. And so it was harder to study when you're constantly worrying about the dynamics of being the new kid on the block. But, while I started off rough and those experiences left me with sort of a residual complex post-traumatic stress throughout my life, I had a unique benefit of being offered to someone offered to somehow believed in me. I don't know why. But they actually I was actually in prayer one day trying to decide if I should send my first wife to work so I could change jobs, just long enough so I could change jobs, because I was driving produce trucks at the time, about 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, and it was kind of beating me down. And I just got this super strong impression that I should apply for college. And I'd never, ever thought about college. I thought that was a ridiculous idea. I figured I got my cosmic channels mixed up with somebody. I said, okay, well, this obviously isn't meant for me. But it was really strong. And so I called the University of Arizona. I asked them for an application. I got the application. I had to get my first wife's help to actually read and complete the application. That's how pathetic I was. And I had never taken SAT scores. And so I long story short, 2 weeks later, I got an acceptance letter. And this was like a month before school was supposed to start. So I looked at that and I think my first impression was, wow, man, I used to think college was for all the really smart kids. They'll let anybody into college. And, you know, I was 18 units deficient on the basic minimum requirements. It was all these weird, miraculous kind of things that kind of were out of the control, but I still didn't have any money. So I threw the letter away. And I think it was the very next day or 2 days after that, I got a letter from my father-in-law who was very concerned with my ability to provide for his daughter, and but felt that I had a tough life and had some potential, and if I was willing to do the hard work of working to support myself, he would do the hard work of paying for my tuition and books. And so I accepted. And to be honest, the first few years were very rough. I was struggling to get D's and C's and thinking that this was a waste of his money and my time. But something I didn't want to give up. I knew in my heart that that was my one ticket out of poverty, and that giving up would essentially be accepting a life of poverty. And I didn't. I worked tirelessly, oftentimes 18 hours a day, between work and school and family life. And somewhere around halfway in the middle, things started really clicking, and I started doing exceptionally well.
That's wonderful.
I made a deal with the dean of the business college. Now, I was an economics undergrad with a finance and computer science minors, and I made a deal with him. One of the things I had to do to graduate was to build a macroeconomic model, which is basically a very complicated math, nonlinear regression probability model that would predict GNP, unemployment, interest rates a few quarters out. And all of the banks do these. The Federal Reserve does these type of models. All the universities build their own models to try and get as good as or better than the banks. And so I made him a deal. I said, well, if I can beat everybody else in the school, would you consider a scholarship for me? And he agreed that he would consider it. And so I went about the business of trying to build my model. And I was in the data center for months, every night from like midnight to 8 a.m. because that's when it was least crowded and I could get as much access to the computers as I wanted. I went through hundreds and hundreds of iterations of my model, and I was based on a theory that I had that hadn't been proven yet. And the theory was that our economy is what was driving the errors in most of the other models is that none of them were accounting for the productivity gains of technology. They were only counting the dollar value of the technology sold. And so I developed a way to predict that. And as it turned out, my model outperformed the Federal Reserve, outperformed all the major banks, outperformed every other university in the country. And I got my scholarship. I got an acceptance into Harvard. It got me a job interim job at IBM for my grad school. So it was the proof for me that the pathway for me to change my stars was an undying perseverance. That even though it was hard was only defined by how much work I was willing to put into getting it done. And so that changed my life, and that started my career. And that started a whole different life for me, and it was an amazing experience. After that, then I went on to work for IBM, and then I worked for an international oil company, Occidental, working directly with all of the senior level executives and the board directors themselves. I worked for them for about 13 years before I switched and did some startup work. Then I worked with Oracle and Unisys and then ultimately Microsoft. And I was known as an innovator, always trying to look at the latest technologies and trying to figure out how they could improve operations. So I was an early adapter of the Internet for global communications. I was an early adapter of multi-site networking, linked networking systems. I was an early adapter of an early stage form of artificial intelligence called expert knowledge systems. And so I was constantly pushing the edge in terms of our ability to use technology to do to work better, faster, and less expensive. And so that was kind of how I built a career. But during that time, one of the things that I think influenced me the most about college was learning about the men of the Renaissance. And that became a real theme for me for many years. Men of the Renaissance were well-trained and practiced in a variety of different things. They were what we would call a generalist. While our economy and most of our jobs really try and strive for somebody who's a specialist in something, they were striving to have people who were well-balanced in science, religion, art, politics, business, where they could converse and understand and interpret, interpret life through all of those lenses. And so while I was at my career, I also wrote songs. I wrote songs for Disney Records for a little while. Recorded some of my own CDs. I love the ocean, so I bought a large sailing ship and earned a Coast Guard charter captain license so I could take people on great trips. I was a certified scuba diver, and I used to like going diving. My favorite dives were with sharks, believe it or not. That was not the activity that my current wife really liked. I went shark diving on our honeymoon, and she was like, "Are you kidding me?" She says, "I'm going to be a widow before I'm a married woman." So there was always a little bit of willing to stretch the edges a little bit too far, I think sometimes. But I think that kind of defines a lot of who I am. I get obsessed with certain mysteries and will spend years solving them or researching them. One of them was a time when I was reading a National Geographic article, and it was talking about the loss of fish stocks and all of the global major fishing grounds. And I had somehow read a passage in Revelations that talked about the end times having a third of the fish of the sea dying, a third of the birds of the air, a third of the beasts of the land. And I started realizing that I had been reading all of those various types of articles in National Geographic for a number of years. And so rather than trying to deal with all of the allegories of prophecy, I tried to say, well, what are the outcomes? What are the outcomes that I can go back and correlate to documented evidence, right, of some of it being completed. And I spent 3 days basically building a fairly complicated regression analysis and probability model that basically tried to look at, well, what is the likelihood that all of these things would happen? I chose about 15 different prophecies because I wanted a small sample set and something, each one with good, strong scientific documentation. And I wanted to come up with, what's the probability that we're actually living in the end times? And that came up with an astounding number of 1 in 1.4 trillion that it was random chance, which told me that I needed to pay attention to the world around me in a different way. And so that was just one example. Another example, and all of these examples somehow filter into my books over the years. Another example was, go ahead if you had a question.
Oh no, I was gonna.
Okay.
Not yet.
Well,
I was just waiting.
Yeah, another example was my son. I was a single parent for a teenage or preteen son, and I was a single parent for about 10 years before I met my second wife. And during that time, he loved to read, and like most boys in that preteen age, they liked adventure and Hardy Boys and pirates and lost treasure and lost civilizations. And so I wanted to write him a short story and that he could read. And so I like to base things off of, a good story that's based off of something real. And so I stumbled onto a real story of Henry Morgan. Now, most people are not necessarily that aware, but in 1672, the real Henry Morgan, not the rum, they named the rum after him, took 36 ships, 2,000 men to raid the city of Panama. And ultimately, long story short, after several months of torturing people and doing all that kind of stuff, he came back with 30 tons, $1 billion worth of plunder, and 600 slaves. But when he reached his fleet, he cheated all of his men and disappeared with almost the entire treasure on 3 ships and 500 slaves, none of it ever seen again. But Morgan survived, and he showed up in Jamaica about 4 months later. But the British had arrested him immediately because his raid on Panama broke a peace treaty with Spain. But when he got to England, they thought he was a hero. So they knighted him as Sir Henry Morgan, sent him back to Jamaica with a garrison of soldiers as lieutenant governor. So he had power, he had people, and they told him to get rid of piracy. But instead of going after any pirates, except for one man who cheated him in Panama before he cheated everybody else, he went into this haunted, drunken debauchery and never went after his plunder, $1 billion plunder, and he burned his logbooks before he died. Then after he died, 3 years after he died, the whole city of Port Royal sank into the ocean, including Morgan's grave. And at the time, many of the locals said they'd been cursed by Morgan. Now, all of that is true, and it captivated me. So I spent well over a decade trying to figure out what happened to 30 tons of stuff, 3 ships, and 500 souls. And then what happened to Morgan that traumatized him so severely, so deeply, that he would give up $1 billion plunder. That journey not only led me to plausible scenarios of where it went, who found a piece of it, and why he wouldn't go back, that connected to an island conquered by Morgan's uncle, Edward Morgan, that was turned into a pirate base. That same island, the Spanish had conquered 100 years earlier, and there was an Inquisition massacre that killed everybody on the island and ended a 2,000-year pilgrimage to the island before anyone found out why people were canoeing 50 miles to this island. That pilgrimage connected me to the 5,000-year Mayan calendar and the Mayan creation myth. And once I understood the Mayan creation myth, I was able to go in and basically interpret some of the Mayan end of the world prophecies. So that took me well over 10 years. And by that point, my son was already grown. So writing him a book, it was like, okay, well, this needs to be an adult book. And that became one of my books. So that was the backstory for one of my books. So I get very obsessed about certain questions. And and because that's what kind of, I guess when you say who I am, I'm sort of this artistic nerd in that sense, where I'm always looking to try and answer a question that maybe seems, in some cases, unanswerable.
Okay, that was excellent. And then tell us about the true story inspiration for your thriller, Swarm.
Oh, that was another amazing story and another experience where I couldn't put a situation down. In my career, I would always like to read. I was in oil and gas at the time, and so I read a lot of science, a lot of geology. I was trying to understand chemical, EPA, environmental issues. And I happened to stumble on an article. It was an Associated Press article. And so I knew it wasn't just somebody pulling baloney out of their head. But the article was just a very short article. It only had 2 very short paragraphs, maybe 3 or 4 sentences. And it basically said that a program had escaped the Lawrence Livermore Laboratories at Sandia. And if I knew anything, to contact this professor or that FBI agent in charge of the investigation. And that was it. It didn't say anything else. I couldn't find, I looked all around other magazines, other sources. I couldn't find any other place where I could see any other information about that. And my first thought was, okay, well, there's somebody at the there's either somebody at the Associated Press who's going to get a ding on their career for a typo, that maybe it should have said the program was lost, or maybe it was stolen, or maybe it malfunctioned. But the verb that they used was that the program had escaped. And so then I thought, well, maybe somebody at the NSA lab, so Lawrence Livermore Laboratories is an NSA spy lab. So I'm starting to look at this and I'm thinking, okay, it's telling me that a spy program has escaped the NSA spy labs, and they're looking for help. They don't know how to find it. I thought, that is a cool story. That's an amazing piece of, for 2 short paragraphs, that's a lot of punch. And so I actually became obsessed with this. I kept thinking, okay, well, what if it's true? What if it wasn't a typo? And so I used my understanding of various technologies, and I tried to come up with plausible architectures and techniques, and how I wanted to answer 3 questions. How could a program escape the NSA labs? Which implied intelligence. Escape implies intelligence. It implies an intent. It implies the ability to move itself. And then it applies the ability to erase its trail in all the computer logs so that people can't say, well, it moved from here to there. So that's pretty amazing capability. So then it came to my second question was, okay, so what was the NSA trying to do that it needed a program that could do all of that really, really cool super spy stuff? And so I spent a few months going to my office and my data center and looking at various ways that I would want a program to basically do spy stuff. Turn on your camera or your microphone on your computer without turning on the light so you don't know it's on. Back then we had widescreen monitors, but basically reverse the polarity on the monitor to be able to use it as sort of a rudimentary camera. Even what we now call, I had a number of other, spoofing your keyboard and all kinds of other things that I had basically kind of come up with. And then I had to kind of determine, well, why do I think it left? What happened that I thought the program basically left and never came back? And so at the time, a good friend of mine, Jack Teeter, had a film production company named Sojourn Entertainment, and he was looking for great ideas. And so I brought this great idea to him, and he was excited. But instead of doing a movie pilot or a screenplay, we said, well, this is an internet-based program. Was one of the things I had determined. And back then, the internet was fairly young and kind of nuanced. And so I said, well, let's produce a webisode series instead. So we did. We hired out-of-work actors. We wrote scripts. I did all the programming in the HTML. We basically produced the show. It was a huge hit. We got like 24 different web awards. We had fans from China to Israel to Europe to all over the place. One of my biggest fans was I didn't know him by anything other than his alias for the longest time. He used to write me almost every week. And his alias, get this, was orbit at nasa.gov. So he wasn't Guy.Morris at NASA, or he wasn't Guy at NASA, as if everyone would know who Guy is. But he was orbit. So that's pretty cool alias. That's like saying I'm Rocket Man, you're Moonwalker, I'm going to be orbit. That's a guy that's pretty high up there, He's got some creds and a little bit of pull to say, no, I want a really cool alias. So I finally figured out, he finally told me, and he was the director at the time, he was the director of flight operations for the Houston Space Center. He taught all the astronauts how to fly the space shuttle. So 2 weeks, and then a studio basically optioned the show. 2 weeks before the studio was going to exercise their option, 2 FBI agents showed up at my door. They were rather perturbed that I had figured out something they thought was supposed to be top secret, and then had the audacity to actually write about it. And while I was internally giving myself a fist bump saying yes, my wife was freaking out, thinking, what have I done? Am I going to go to jail? Who did I hack? What did I do? Why are 2 FBI agents sitting at my dining room table? So when they wanted me to take down this show, I told them no. I laughed at them and told them no. They didn't like my sense of humor either, I guess. But they ultimately went back to the studio and killed the deal. So I lost a lot of money. I tucked my tail between my legs. I went and got a job at, I think it was a startup, and then Oracle at that point, and then ultimately went from there to Microsoft. But all of these years, I never forgot that. And that story never left me. Now, in 2016, my analysis was further confirmed when CNN reported that Russia had hacked the CIA cyber toolkit. And in that toolkit was virtually every single one of the programmable capabilities I had determined for this missing program, including what we now call the deep fake video technology. So that's the technology that can take Camille's voice or take Camille's video image and digitize it and then manipulate it so that it gets you saying something or doing something you didn't really do. And it's used for misinformation, could be used for espionage, could be used for, imagine an executive basically calling his secretary and saying, Suzanne, I can't remember my password again. What is it? Right? So that character, that program became a character in my espionage books, and that was sort of the initial thrust of what was of those stories. And I continued to do research. I continued to try and understand, well, how are governments using cyber tools to do espionage? How are they using artificial intelligence to do these things? What are the roles of these technologies that are hidden under the covers that most people will never see, that make the world a scarier place in a sense? And I wanted to, so that became sort of those, and what I ultimately did in the books was I combined that theme of advanced technologies being used in malicious, nefarious ways with the theme that I had developed a few years earlier, that of how to, using math and programmable elements, determine whether or not we had entered end-time prophecy. And in the story, the computer program that has escaped, in the fictional sense, has now reached what we call sentient singularity. Now, what that means is sentient means that it's self-aware. It has a perception of itself as a separate entity from us, and that it differently in construction and worldview than us. And then singularity means it's as smart as a smart human. So it's a self-aware, super smart AI. And I named it. I named it Sylvia. So sophisticated language virtual intelligence algorithm. And so the Sylvia has now decoded end-time prophecy. And none of the other characters really understand really what it means. It's a fugitive program. It's working with underground people in the dark web, and they don't understand what that means. And so it creates a premise for me to not only explore technologies that are racing ahead of our morals and our laws and our ability to control them, and including all the ways that AI is dangerous. And that's a whole separate topic. Elon Musk, Bill Gates, Stephen Hawking have all warned against artificial intelligence, and I go into some of the reasons why. And then the corruption, how it's being polluting our espionage and infecting that, and then combining that with sort of the hubris of man, how our politics are becoming corrupt, how church and religious movements have become politicized. And corrupted, things like climate change, population, hunger crisis, all of these major crises I can pull into this sort of sphere, literary sphere of an artificial intelligence that has decoded end-time prophecy and leading the characters to discover how these dots connect. And so that became the premise of the two books.
Okay. Oh, wow. That's a lot. That's excellent. Excellent. But I only have 2 minutes left.
Oh, my gosh. Okay. I didn't realize we had so much time.
Yeah, we have 30 minutes. But I'm going to see if maybe you could schedule another day to come back on, because and then I can schedule it for longer. Because you are so interesting, and I'm just like, whoa, I'm just like really amazed. So at any rate, before you go, can you just let our audience know what your favorite hot beverage is, or coffee?
Oh, well, I'm a coffee drinker. That's my go juice. I get up in the morning. I'll have 2 or 3 cups of coffee. I'll have one piece of toast, a half banana. And between that and a few cups of coffee, that's my go. Yeah.
Okay. Wonderful.
I used to drink it black, but my wife bought this little tiny cup thing that actually foams up the coffee. And I found that I've really kind of grown addicted to sort of my coffee with this little foamy milk on top of it. So it's sort of like a latte, but a homemade latte.
Yes.
And so that's my go-to. And then after that, I'll go to Earl Grey.
Oh, great. Got it. All right. Thank you so much, Guy, for coming on.
Thank you.
And yes, it's just a pleasure listening to you. And okay, and that ends our show, actually. So thank you for now. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
You're welcome. Bye.